what is now being emphasized, especially in my circles since about 2015, maybe a little bit earlier than that, but really starting to get ahead of steam, is the assertion, and this is discussed by people like Turretin. Calvin wasn't big on it, but Turretin and the more Reformed scholastic of the second, third generations, they do discuss these things, obviously, is the assertion that the attributes of God in God, ad intra is the Latin phrase, that the attributes of God are one and are to be not to be distinguished. That God does not distinguish internally between his wrath and his love, or his justice and his love, I guess is a better term.
Okay.
Or between omniscience.
His justice is his love, and
Exactly.
his love is his justice.
And his love is his omniscience, and his love is his omnipresence. The things that make these things even understandable, and for me, one of the important parts, these attributes interact with each other. One of the most beautiful things of seeing the cross is recognizing you're seeing the love of God and the holiness of God at the exact same time.
Right.
But if they're the same attribute, then we can't understand what's going on there. Mm-hmm. So internally to God, we are told we must believe that these attributes are all one, and here's the reason. Now, by the way, ad extra, outside of God, they are different, and we are to distinguish between them, and in fact, we glorify God by distinguishing them. But God doesn't glorify. Right. God isn't glorified by that internally, is basically what's being said.
Right.
And so here's the problem. When you think about what is being said about the attributes being the same, I can say easily all the attributes are harmonious. Yeah. They are not parts. But what's being forced on us is
we don't stack them up.
Exactly.
Right.
But what's being forced on us is a metaphysical assumption that comes from Thomas, and part of it comes from before Thomas to somebody else named Aristotle. Right. And the idea is, and some people may have heard of this idea before, and this is how I explained it to you, was when we think about the ontological argument, which is an argument I don't like to think about very often because I only have so much Advil with me while I'm traveling. But if you've thought about the argument itself, an essence of it is the being greater than which none can be conceived. The idea of thinking of something in that metaphysical system means that it actually exists. That category becomes concrete in an argument type sense.
If I successfully conceived of it, then it is that way.
And it can be put into the argument as a valid element of the argument. So if I can conceive of God's attributes, then they become separate parts, which then becomes a denial of God's simplicity.
Right.
So I am not to conceive of God's attributes internally to him as having any difference from one another, or I am making him a composite being and denying the doctrine of simplicity.
Now, what would the response be if I said, well, I conceive of the Father and the Son and the Spirit as different?
That is the primary argument that they want to push back against and respond to. They've written entire books on. Thomas liked to write books, just like Thomas did. So they're sort of like father, like children. It sort of goes together. And in that instance, you get into extremely complicated discussions about how subsistences are not the same as attributes would be if they had this kind of reality.
Distinction.
So there's always a way to make a philosophical distinction between one aspect or another. But I'll leave it to the Thomists to explain exactly how they deal with that, because it does have applications to other things. Once you have this idea of simplicity, not just what you and I would agree, that God's being is not composed of different parts. Once you have the further assertion of the ad intra sameness, then that starts having impact in other areas. And one of the areas that I'm most concerned about is in Trinitarian theology and in the relationship of the divine persons.
Right. Because